All right. Look, I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again, because apparently the universe loves irony. Some groups hide their secrets in caves. O9A hides theirs on the front page, right next to a pentagram drawn by someone who definitely failed geometry. Okay, look, if you've ever looked at a symbol and thought, yeah, that definitely looks like something you'd find carved on a bathroom door in a haunted gas station at 3 a.m., well, congratulations. You already understand the vibe of the O9A because their symbols, they're like the graphic design version of a migraine. Circles, angles, triangles, weird numerology, all mixed with that quiet, I'm absolutely doing something illegal energy. And the crazy part is, these symbols weren't just slapped together by some edgy 16-year-old with a sketchbook and a Hot Topic membership. No, they came from a very specific place, a very specific ideology, and a very, very specific type of psychological warfare. And the more you decode them, the more you see what these people were actually trying to do. But hey, before we get sucked into that black hole, let me say this properly. For anyone stumbling in here by accident, welcome. I'm Mo, the guy who talks about everything weird and mysterious on this planet. And if this video popped up in your feed because the algorithm thinks you're a little too normal, congratulations, you've just entered the dark tunnel. And trust me, this one gets ugly. So, yeah, hit that subscribe, join the family, and let's keep peeling this rotten onion together. I'm not gonna hit you with flashy edits or staged photos or some dramatic exclusive footage that I found buried in a dumpster behind an Illuminati Marshall store. That stuff distracts you from the real point. The evidence, the history, the documents, the receipts. Here, it's just you, me, and whatever is hiding behind this symbolism that's been floating around the internet for decades with zero context. So grab your coffee, your whiskey, or that suspicious energy drink that tastes like battery acid and childhood trauma. Flip your phone sideways, kill the lights, and focus. And like I always say, even if you think you've heard this story before, trust me, it never matches what I'm about to tell you. All right, O9. A symbolism. Where do we even start? Why does the O9A even have symbols? And what the hell are they supposed to mean? Here's the thing. Groups like the O9A never just pick an image because it looks cool. They pick symbols the same way intelligence agencies pick code words. Carefully, strategically, and with layers that only make sense once you start putting the puzzle pieces together. You know how, in my earlier episode, The Order of Nine Angles Exposed one, we broke down their ideology, the neo-Nazi overlaps, the whole insight role thing, the documented court cases, and all that academic stuff from people like Nicholas Goodrick Clarke, Jacob C Senholt, Anton Stern, and the University of Chicago researchers? Yeah, the symbols are the visual version of that entire system. Let's start with the big one, the septenary star. You've seen it. 7 points, 7 spheres, 7 gates, whatever flavor of chaos people like to call it. Now, the O9A didn't invent 7-point stars. That symbol is older than half the civilizations on this planet. You see 7-point geometry in ancient Mesopotamian astronomy, in Greek mystical texts, in medieval alchemy. It shows up in the heptagram used by the early Christian mystics, and even in the writings of the 12th century occult philosopher Hugh of St. Victor. And usually, in all those older systems, the number 7 relates to the classical planets, the same ones ancient astronomers could see with the naked eye. Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. Basic stuff you can double-check in any medieval cosmology reference or even the Cambridge history of magic and witchcraft. But here's where it gets twisted. The O9A took that old symbol, that ancient, multi-civilizational heptagram, and forced it into their own invented cosmology. They attached each point to what they call a nexion, basically a gateway, and tied those nexions to their pseudo-mythology, their version of the Sinister Tradition, and their entire occult framework. They even mapped those points onto their ritual system, the same system documented in their early texts, like Naos and Hostia, which were circulating in zines in the late 1980s and early 1990s. If you want to fact-check that, search the archived O9A manuscripts that academics like Senholt and Sterin analyzed in their research. Those texts are public, ugly, and badly formatted, but they're real. And that's already weird enough. But wait, it gets deeper. What the O9A really cared about wasn't the symbol itself. It was the interpretation. The star was designed to look ancient, to look forbidden, to look like it came from some secret pre-Christian cult hidden under the floorboards of human civilization. But here's the truth, and this is confirmed in multiple academic analyses, including Goodrick Clarke's study of post-war occult Nazism and the Exeter University thesis, work on O9A's myth-making. The O9A made up their own mythology, like literally invented it. They created the illusion of an ancient tradition to give their system weight, legitimacy, mystique. The same trick far-right esoteric groups used throughout the 20th century. So the septenary star? Yeah, it's not ancient. O9A lore. It's 1970s. British fan fiction dressed up in robes and ritual knives. But again, that's not even the part that matters. The real significance is how they used it. Because if you look at far-right extremist circles that got infiltrated by O9A members, and again, this is documented in court records from the US, UK, Australia, Canada, and Germany, you'll notice something fascinating. The symbol shows up like graffiti tagging. It's not just a religious symbol. It's a chat network marker, a sign that says, "We're here, we're inside. We're watching who recognizes this." There's a reason counter-extremism researchers, like the Anti-Defamation League, the UK Home Office reports from 2020 to 2021, and multiple academic terrorism papers, call O9A symbolism a radicalization vector. It's not random. It's not decorative. It's a signal. You ever see a symbol and think, why does this feel like a dog whistle that I'm not supposed to understand? Yeah, that's exactly the point. Now, if the septenary star is the big symbol, then the sigil of the 9 angles is the one that confuses people the most. It looks like something you'd get if you fed geometry homework into a blender. A weird angular shape, triangles intersecting, 9 points, 9 edges, 9 angles, depending on how you count it. And here's where the academic side comes in. The earliest versions of that sigil appear in the works attributed to Anton Long, the pseudonym tied to David Mayan, the guy whose writings are the backbone of O9A doctrine. This isn't speculation. This is widely documented, not only in Mayat's own essays and letters, but also in the extensive research compiled by scholars studying post-war neo-Nazi networks. If you look at publications from the International Center for the Study of Radicalization, ICSR, or even the archives of the Journal of Terrorism Research, you'll see that Mayat's ideological fingerprints are everywhere. So what was that sigil actually for? According to the O9A writings themselves, it represents dimensional gates. Literal ones? No. Symbolic ones? Also no. It's more psychological, a diagram of how a person ascends through their system. Each angle represents a stage, a trial, a transformation. Kind of like a spiritual video game, but instead of collecting coins, you're collecting felonies. You know how, in my old O9A episode, I explained insight roles? That whole process where members infiltrate political groups, religious groups, or even criminal networks to transcend the ego and experience the sinister? Well, this sigil is basically the map for that worldview. It's not occult magic, it's ideology disguised as mysticism. And that disguise? That's the trick. If you wrap extremism in spiritual symbols, teenagers who think they're joining a secret dark magic society suddenly find themselves knee-deep in actual neo-Nazi accelerationism. This isn't my opinion. This exact pipeline has shown up in declassified case files from the U.S. Department of Justice, the Crown Prosecution Service in the UK, and Australian counter-terrorism trials. Young recruits thought they were doing ritual magic. Turns out they were being groomed for ideological extremism. That's why understanding the symbols matters, because the symbols are the bait. And while we're here, let me ask you, did you ever see a group whose symbols were this complicated and think, yeah, these are probably totally normal people? Exactly. Drop me a comment if you'd ever seen that septenary star online and thought it was something totally different. Because half the internet misidentifies it as everything from a Wiccan symbol to a random metal band logo. You'd be shocked how many people have no idea what they're reposting. And by the way, before someone jumps into the comments like, Mo, are you saying every 7-point star is O9A? No, absolutely not. Please go touch grass. Symbols get reused constantly, and a heptagram shows up in like 20 different religions and subcultures. The key is context. O9. A symbols show up paired with their terminology. Things like Nexian, Sinister, a return to Vindex, the Acausal, the Tree of Wyrd. Those phrases, those are the giveaways. Those are the words that show up in their original manuscripts, which academics have traced back through multiple decades of zines, pamphlets, and typed documents. So yeah, symbolism is only half the picture. Language is the other half. And once you combine the two, it becomes almost impossible not to spot who's borrowing from O9A, who's inspired by them, and who's outright echoing their ideology. All right, that's a lot to chew on. But trust me, we're only warming up. Because in the next part, we're going deeper into the second layer of O9A symbolism. The runes, the numerology, the weird, sinister dialects, and how these symbols evolved as the group infiltrated online spaces. And let me tell you, some of that stuff gets real uncomfortable real fast. All right, let's keep descending, because if part 1 was the front porch of this haunted house, part 2 is where we start hearing footsteps upstairs, even though nobody's home. This is where O9A symbolism stops being O weird shapes and starts turning into, wait, why do these people have a whole secret alphabet like they're trying to summon a 1990s dial-up modem demon? And remember, I told you, the symbols aren't just drawings. They're psychological traps, recruitment tools, breadcrumbs for anyone wandering too close to the edge. And the deeper we go, the more you'll see the same pattern that showed up in the court cases, the academic research, the intelligence briefings, all that stuff we talked about in the first O9A episode now. The next layer, the runes. Because of course, they have runes. If there's one universal law of extremist occult groups, it's this. So, you mix Nazism with Satanism, what do you get? Runes. Always runes. The O9A didn't just borrow from Norse runes or Germanic esoteric symbolism, they appropriated them, in the same way far-right occultists have done since the 1930s. You can fact-check that easily. Look up the work of historian Nicholas Goodrick Clarke, especially his book, The Occult Roots of Nazism, where he documents how Nazi-era mystics used runes as identity markers, magical symbols, and political statements wrapped in mysticism. O9A just modernized the trick. Take the Algi's rune. Looks like a peace sign that forgot how to be peaceful. You'll see O9A variations of it in their early manuscripts. Nows, the Black Book of Satan, Hostia. They use it as a symbol of Acausal energy, or Wyrd direction. Basically their way of saying destiny, but evil and unnecessarily complicated. Then there's Odal, which, if you've ever looked into neo-Nazi symbolism, you already know is a big one. The O9A adopted it, twisted it, and attached it to their concept of Vindex, their mythological savior figure. And if you watched my old episode, you know exactly why this matters. Vindex is the fictional warrior messiah they believed would overthrow modern society, not metaphorically, literally. This wasn't just aesthetic. This was ideology disguised as aesthetics. And here's the crazy part. And this is documented in counter-extremism research from groups like the Counter-Terrorism Policing Southeast, UK, and the ADL, when police raided homes of individuals linked to Adam Waffen Division, Sonnenkrieg Division, the Feuerkrieg Division, and a few lone actor extremists. Guess what symbols they found scribbled in notebooks, on flags, on walls? Yep, the same O9A modified runes, not just Nazi runes, O9A versions of them. Which means these people weren't just inspired by far-right ideology, they were reading O9A texts. So, let me ask you, how many groups do you know that create their own spin-off versions of symbols, like they're running some occult graphic design studio? Because that's the thing. A lot of these symbols weren't meant for the public. They were meant for initiation. The runes mark out identity. The star marks out cosmology. But the numerology, that marks out loyalty. And, oh man, numerology is where the O9A stops pretending they're edgy philosophers and starts revealing the real skeleton under the hood. Let's talk numbers. You've probably seen the number 9 plastered everywhere. 9 angles, 9 emanations, 9 spheres, 9 gates, 9 rituals, 9 stages. It's all over their writings. Not for magical reasons. That's the illusion. The real reason is structure. David Myatt, or Anton Long, depending on which academic you follow, built the system around the number 9 because it allowed him to map the entire ideology into a closed-loop 9 points, 9 challenges, 9 transformations. It's basically a self-contained radicalization system, a conveyor belt masked as spirituality. And if you think I'm exaggerating, look up Senholt's thesis, Secret Identities in the Sinister Tradition, which explores how O9A uses numerology as a psychological framework, or Stern's academic analysis of O9A's ritual structure. These aren't random numbers, they're structural markers. Now, let's go one layer weirder, because O9, the numerology starts normal. Well, as normal as this group gets, but then drifts into what they call the Acausal. If you've never heard that word, good. It means you haven't fallen into this rabbit hole voluntarily. Acausal is O9A's way of saying stuff outside time and physical reality. It's not real physics, it's metaphor. They took the concept from early 20th century esoteric writers, and I mean literally borrowed the vocabulary, then used it to create the illusion of some transcendental cosmic order. Their numerology claims certain symbols open acausal connections, which sounds like science, but is actually just mysticism written in the language of physics. You see this pattern in their manuscripts, especially in Naos, where they describe ritual steps mapped onto the 9 angles. And again, this isn't me guessing. This is in the original documents, anyone can read them. They're archived online in several university collections, precisely because researchers were studying how extremist groups hide political ideology inside occult imagery. So let's summarize this in rabbit hole language. O9. The numerology is like if someone took algebra, removed the math, added some fake metaphysics, sprinkled in some neo-Nazi ideology, and wrapped the whole thing in a ritual manual written by someone who hates paragraph breaks. But wait, we're still not done. Because now we need to talk about one of the strangest parts of O9, a symbolism. Their invented language. If you've ever seen words like Vindex, Drek, Nexion, Acausal, Satanus, Wordful, Might is Right, or Sinister Dialectic, those didn't come from ancient manuscripts. They came from the O9A playbook. These words are part of what linguists call constructed esoteric jargon. Language created intentionally to reshape identity and thought. Same method used by cults, extremist groups, and, surprise, intelligence agencies when they're building psychological profiles. You ever notice how these words sound dramatic but mean nothing until you read their literature? That's the point. Language equals gateway. Gateway equals identity shift. Identity shift equals exactly what the insight roles were designed to produce. And if you tie this back to their symbols, you start seeing the pattern. Symbol arrow catches your eye rune, makes you feel like you're entering something ancient. Numerology gives you a map. Jargon forces your brain into their worldview. You think you're doing dark magic? No, you're being rewired. This isn't speculation. Multiple counter-extremism researchers have identified O9A's sinister dialect as a psychological conditioning tool. The UK Home Office literally flagged O9A's use of language in their 2020 briefing when assessing whether the group should be designated as a terrorist organization. Not designated yet, but monitored heavily. Now let me throw something at you that most people never notice. The O9A uses symbols as a form of plausible deniability. If you Google O9A symbols, most images look like occult Pinterest boards. That's intentional. It's camouflage. If your symbol looks like an ancient sigil, you can say, "Oh, that's not extremist. It's just esoteric." and the uninformed audience believes it. But the people who know, they know. This tactic appears in Myatt's own writings, specifically his essays on aeonic strategy. He talks about long-term infiltration, cultural contamination, occult camouflage, and layered meaning, all documented in his collected works and referenced in multiple academic papers. O9A symbols aren't symbols. They're masks. You ever see someone online using the septenary star but claiming, oh, it's just a spiritual symbol? Yeah, that's the mask in action. Remember how in the last episode, I broke down the Atomwaffen Division's O9A infiltration and the Sonnenkrieg Division case? Those groups didn't use the symbols because they were suddenly into magic. They used them because O9A taught them that symbols can hide ideology in plain sight. That's why decrypting this stuff matters, because symbols are the entry point. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever seen a symbol online and felt like it was speaking a different language? That's exactly what these groups want. Confusion is a recruitment tool. People don't join out of understanding. They join out of curiosity. Drop a comment if you've ever seen O9A symbols floating around forums and thought they were part of some edgy aesthetic movement, because that's how most recruits find them. Aesthetic first, ideology later. And listen, I know this topic is confusing, overwhelming, and just gross, but we need to keep going, because we haven't even touched the part where O9A symbolism merges with violence, with culling, with their ritual myth-making, and with how online extremist groups have rebranded their symbols for Gen Z recruitment. Yeah, that's a thing. A real documented thing. All right. So if parts 1 and 2 were like staring at the surface of the lake, part 3 is where something grabs your ankle and pulls you straight under. Because now we're talking about the symbols that didn't just sit in their little occult notebooks. These are the ones tied directly to their rituals, their ideology, and, yeah, the darker stuff. The stuff O9A members have been charged, arrested, and prosecuted over in real life. Which means no speculation, no drama, no creepypasta Pinterest occultism. Just receipts. And let me tell you, once you understand these symbols, you'll see exactly how O9A took a made-up cosmology, wrapped it in the language of ancient mythology, and used it to justify extremism, all hidden behind diagrams and mystical drawings. All right, let's go. So, the Tree of Wyrd. This one's hilarious and weird and deeply, deeply strategic. You've probably seen it if you've ever Googled O9A without knowing what you were looking at. It looks like if someone tried to redesign the Kabbalistic tree of life, but got bored halfway through, and replaced the rest with shapes they saw on the back of an algebra textbook. But here's the real story. The O9. A Tree of Wyrd isn't ancient. It's not pagan. It's not runic. And it's definitely not some rediscovered pre-Christian map of the cosmos. All that ancient tradition talk, that's part of their myth-making strategy. A strategy that academics like Senholt and Sterin both wrote about in their research on O9A's invented history. The Tree of Wyrd appears in O9A texts starting in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Specifically in the documents attributed to Anton Long, the pseudonym linked to David Myatt. This isn't rumor. This is documented in multiple university-level analyses, including Exeter University's studies on O9A manuscripts. So what is the Tree of Wyrd? It's basically O9A's flowchart for how a human being is supposed to move through the Acausal. Translation into normal English, it's their self-radicalization roadmap. Each sphere, each node, is tied to a ritual, a psychological transformation, or an insight roll. And yes, insight rolls are exactly the same concept from the previous episode. The idea that you infiltrate groups, communities, organizations, or even extremist cells to experience and transcend your own morality. So when you see the Tree of Wyrd, understand this clearly. It isn't a mystical diagram. It's a behavioral conditioning system dressed up as occult geometry, and the symbols connected to each sphere in that tree. Those are what members use during rituals, which brings us to the next layer. The dark gods. Now, I know, this sounds ridiculous. Dark gods. What are we in a Dungeons & Dragons campaign? But here's where it gets interesting, because the dark gods are not deities. They're metaphors for states of being. You can see this in early O9A texts like the Mythos of the Dark Gods, the Grimoire of Baphomet, and Codex Saris. These documents describe the dark gods not as literal beings, but as archetypal energies, atavistic forms, and sinister aspects of human nature. This isn't a vibe. This is the exact language used in the manuscripts, the same ones archived and analyzed by researchers studying esoteric extremism. But O9A didn't stop there. They gave each dark god a symbol, a sigil. And those sigils? Those are what appear in ritual manuals, in the sevenfold way instructions, and, most disturbingly, in the parts of their writings that discuss culling. And yes, if you watched my first O9A episode, you already know what culling means in their vocabulary. If you're new, culling is their term for selecting individuals to be killed as part of a sinister test of character. This is documented, not rumors. Documented in O9A texts and referenced in court cases across multiple countries. So why symbols? Because symbols let you talk about violence without saying the word members. Performing rituals with dark god sigils were often encouraged to pair the ritual with what O9A calls sinister deeds. That phrase appears repeatedly in O9A literature, including in the text The Dreshen Way, which openly encourages acts of transgression as part of becoming a Drek, their term for someone living without restriction, morality, or empathy. And here's where symbolism matters. When someone draws a dark god sigil, they're not summoning a demon. They're signaling intent. They're stepping into a ritual worldview where violence becomes justified. Let me pause there and ask you something. Have you ever noticed that extremist groups always pretend their ideology has some higher spiritual meaning? O9A didn't invent this trick. They just gamified it. Drop a comment if this is the first time you're hearing about the dark god symbols, because believe me, most people who think they understand O9A have never seen this side of it. Now, let's zoom in even further. Because one of the most important symbols in the O9A universe is the sigil of the so-called Baphomet female, which, if you're used to the Eliphas Levi goat-headed Baphomet, you're going to be confused. O9A's version is nothing like the classical one. Their Baphomet is a dark feminine archetype linked to destruction, culling, and sacrifice. And the symbol they use for her a twisted, angular shape, appears repeatedly in ritual instructions. It shows up in early manuscripts. It appears in the online Nexians. It appears in the digital zines that circulated in the 2000s, and in at least one U.S. court case involving a self-identified O9A adherent. That symbol was found carved into a notebook alongside extremist propaganda. Again, you can fact-check this. Several counterterrorism reports mention the presence of O9A symbols in discovered materials. Now here's something even stranger. Around the early 2000s, when the internet started swallowing everything like a black hole in 480p resolution, O9A symbols began mutating. People started redrawing the septenary star with sharper angles. They started digitizing the sigils. They created ASCII art versions for old forums. They made simplified versions for profile pictures. And here's the wild part. The O9A leadership encouraged it. Why? Because symbols that evolve are harder to track. They adapt. They hide. They blend. You see this discussed in their writings on aeonic strategy. They talk about cultural infiltration, mimetic spread, and sinister memes. Yes, sinister memes is an actual phrase in their documents starting around 2013 to 2016, when groups like Iron March, Atomwaffen Division, and other Accelerationist forums were active. O9A symbols started appearing in modified forms. Neon cyberpunk versions, simplified geometric icons, edgy occult, branding aesthetics, corrupted typography versions, tattoo-friendly designs, minimalist hexagon reconstructions, black and white digital sigils. And now you're thinking, wait, I've seen some of these online and didn't know they were O9A. Exactly. Because their goal wasn't just to spread symbols, it was to spread memes disguised as symbols. This isn't me being poetic. This is documented in O9A's own writings on propaganda researchers at the ETH Zurich Center for Extremism Studies even analyzed how O9A aesthetics became a mimetic pipeline in online radical spaces. Here's the formula O9A used. 1. Pick an old occult concept. 2. Twist it into something dark. 3. Give it a new symbol. 4. Let the internet remix it. 5. Sit back and watch it spread. And that spread allowed O9A influence to reach people who had zero idea what O9A even was. This is why decrypting symbolism is so important. Half the time, people encounter the aesthetic before they encounter the ideology. Now, we have to talk about one symbol that almost nobody outside academic research knows about: the sinister chant glyphs. These are weird, squiggly symbols that appear in the chanting sections of O9A ritual literature. They're not alphabets. They're not ancient runes. They're not from any historical magical system. They were invented, fully, by O9A authors, as a way to create the illusion of an arcane tradition. And the weirder the symbols look, the more forbidden they seem. This is intentional. Goodrick Clarke's work on occult Nazism describes this exact strategy. Groups create pseudo-ancient alphabets to give their ideology mystique. O9A just ran that playbook in the late 20th century. Their chant glyphs show up in the Black Book of Satan, Naos, the Diophel Quintet, Codex Cyrus. Internal Nexian documents circulated in the early 2000s. Researchers have noted that these symbols serve two psychological functions. 1. They separate initiates from outsiders. 2. They shut down critical thinking by introducing ritual awe. They look like something you shouldn't be looking at, and that's the hook. And speaking of hooks, we're about halfway through the symbolism rabbit hole now. Because next, in part 4, we're getting into the really disturbing parts. Ritual clothing symbolism, blood symbolism, the moon phases myth, the hidden references to actual locations in the UK tied to their origins, the symbols designed specifically for online radicalization, and the numerological patterns embedded in their fiction stories. Yes, really. This is where O9A symbolism intersects with real-world extremism cases. The uncomfortable stuff that shows why these symbols matter beyond theory. Alright, so here's where the whole O9A symbolism thing starts to turn into a psychological maze. And honestly, the deeper you go, the more you realize this isn't just edgy occult teenagers drawing stars in notebooks. No, this is a code book built to hide an entire ideology in plain sight. And the funniest part? The code book isn't even that complicated. It's just buried under layers of philosophical trash talk, old manuscripts, and the kind of arrogant writing style that screams, "I own 3 cloaks and no deodorant." But if you're still here, sitting in the dark with me, then let's go further. And I want you to keep an eye on something I mentioned earlier, the whole linguistic camouflage thing, because now we're entering the part where O9A starts embedding meaning inside symbols that the outside world misreads completely. And maybe that's the point. Maybe misreading is part of their design. Or maybe they're just messy writers who like pretending they're running some underground Illuminati reboot. Let's take the Mysterium Fra symbol. Remember how I said it shows up everywhere? Manuscripts, blogs, PDF scans that look like they were created on a Windows 98 device that barely survived Y2K. And every time it appears, whether in Naus, Hostia, or the Diofil Quartet, the context shifts just a little, almost like it's a symbol with a sliding meaning, depending on what phase of the O9A narrative you're in. Now the earliest mentions of it, according to copies of handwritten manuscripts that academics like Jacob Senholt and Maki George Sieg reference, position it as a kind of gateway between the mundane world and the Acausal. That part's consistent, but what is the Acausal? Well, if you read Anton Long's writings, it basically means things we can't perceive because they sit outside linear time, which is, convenient. Anytime something doesn't make sense, boom, Acausal. Anytime a story has holes the size of a semi-truck, boom, Acausal energies. And if you're wondering whether that sounds like someone trying to hide sloppy metaphysics behind cool vocabulary, yeah, same. But here's the serious angle. In academic research, like the work done on O9 Ideology for the Journal for the Study of Radicalism, this symbol is constantly referenced as the central conceal and reveal mechanism, because in their system, the mysterium marks the boundary of forbidden knowledge. Not forbidden like forbidden books, but forbidden like we don't even tell initiates everything until they mentally break. And that's the connection to all the dangerous stuff we talked about in the previous episode. Insight roles, culling, infiltration. because the symbolism isn't separate from their actions. It's the narrative fuel that keeps people motivated enough to do, let's call them, life-ruining side quests. Now here's something you won't get from surface-level Google searches. Ironically, because O9A people flood the internet with nonsense to bury the real material. There are two visual versions of the Mysterium symbol. One is the clean, simple geometric one you've probably seen, and the other is a far more chaotic one scribbled in certain drafts around the late 80s. The second one almost looks like the lines are glitching, but if you trace it carefully, something researchers like Sieg have pointed out, it forms a triadic fractal pattern. And I swear, I'm not making this up. The angles correspond to the exact same 27-angle structure that appears in the O9A tree of Wyrd. Yeah, 27. Because 10 spheres wasn't mystical enough, apparently. And that gives us our bridge. The tree of Wyrd. You probably know the basic version. 7 spheres, labeled with attributes like Mars, Venus, Mercury, all borrowed from Hermetic traditions. But the O9A version mutates it into something, let's say, creative. The 7 spheres are still there, but they expand them into a 21 nodus system, and then beyond that, into a 27 nodus system, and each nodus is considered a checkpoint of the initiate's consciousness. But here's the part you probably never noticed. In the O9A diagram, the spheres aren't evenly spaced. The lines between them aren't symmetrical. The asymmetry is intentional. Why? Because Anton Long wrote, back in the 1990s, in material that Senholt and Goodrick Clarke both scrutinized, that the asymmetry symbolizes the destabilization of causal being. In simpler words, if the diagram looks weird, that's on purpose. But there's a second layer, and this is where the tree of Wyrd crosses paths with the political extremist stuff I covered in your older episode. Each sphere corresponds not just to an esoteric goal, but to a null insight challenge. The same system that structured their infiltration missions. For example, Sphere 6, Mars, equals conflict. Sphere 3, Mercury, equals deception. Sphere 1, Moon, equals emotional transgression. And when you look at the actual court cases tied to O9A adherents, and I'm talking verifiable cases in the UK, US, Germany, and Canada, you see a pattern where individuals explicitly referenced insight training or self-overcoming. They weren't improvising. They were following symbolic instructions. Now, I want to circle back to something subtle. The weird triangle that keeps showing up in modern O9A circles, a triangle with one point downward, often with some runic-looking scribble inside it. People assume it's some generic occult sign or a variant of the inverted delta. But no, this symbol has a name inside O9A circles. The Vindex triangle. Yeah, that Vindex, the same one connected to the coming warrior, the external presencing, the anti-state liberator, all concepts that appear in O9A's political texts and their neo-Nazi materials in the early 2000s. If you missed that story, that was in your older episode. Now here's the thing most people get wrong. The Vindex triangle wasn't originally meant to symbolize a person, it symbolized an event. You can trace this back to O9A writings from the early 90s, which researchers like Goodrick Clarke pulled excerpts from in his analysis of British esoteric fascism, where Anton Long described Vindex as the catalyst for ionic rupture. Not a hero, not a warrior, a disruption. Over time, O9A reinterpreted it, repackaged it, and by the late 2000s, it became a literal call sign for far-right accelerationism. And if you look at extremist Telegram channels linked to O9A offshoots, which was documented in the 2020 to 2021 UK and German counter-terrorism reports, you'll see the triangle everywhere. So what's inside the triangle? A sigil that looks like a rune, but isn't actually from any historical runic alphabet. O9A will tell you it's alchemical, but if you trace the shape, it resembles the combination of the Odal rune, which neo-Nazi groups heavily use, and a stylized crescent. And you'll never guess what Anton Long wrote about crescents in O9, a manuscripts around 1989. That crescents represent the Acausal becoming manifest through conflict. So you end up with a synthetic rune that essentially encodes aeonic change through ethno-political struggle. It's extremist symbolism disguised as occult aesthetics, which is their entire brand. And this is where the Ouroboros you mentioned earlier re-enters the conversation, because they didn't just slap a snake on a symbol and call it a day. They redesigned it. If you look closely at the O9A Ouroboros, the one drawn in their early manuscripts, the head is disproportionately larger than the tail. The body doesn't loop cleanly. The spacing is uneven. Again, asymmetry. This is a theme. And Anton Long actually wrote why in a scanned letter from 1991 that academics like Sigils, quote, "Symmetry is the illusion of the undeveloped mind. The Acausal reveals itself only in pattern disruption." So, the Ouroboros isn't eating itself. It's choking itself intentionally, symbolizing that the current aeon, the one they believe is ruled by Magian influence, which is their coded anti-Semitic framework, must collapse in on itself before a new one can emerge. They hide an entire extremist manifesto inside a drawing of a snake, and people miss it because they think it's just occult vibes. And look, I'm curious, how many of you ever noticed this stuff in the symbols before? Drop me a comment, because I swear, once you see the hidden framework, it changes how you read the whole O9A ecosystem. Now don't get too comfortable, because next we're going into the deeper symbolic layer, language itself, the Mayat era ciphers, the hidden numerology, the reason they built a fake proto-language and embedded political rhetoric inside its grammar. So, let's talk about something O9, a people absolutely love, flexing about, their secret language. I swear, every fringe group thinks inventing a language makes them more mysterious. But O9A took it to a different level. They built a system that's not actually a language. It's more like an ideological filter, a way to turn normal words into covert signals. Enter the star game, the Noctulian language, and their funky little numerology grid. Let's start with the Noctulian text. If you've ever seen it, it looks like someone mixed Tolkien Elvish with early MySpace emo font, but buried inside it. And this is something researchers like George Sieg and Jacob Senholt have pointed out. The language isn't built for communication. It's built for initiation. Here's what I mean. In the earliest manuscripts, some handwritten, some typed on old-school typewriters, the Noctulian characters have numerical values. Each letter corresponds to a causal or acausal attribute. Basically, even numbers. Causal, rational, human behavior. Odd numbers. Acausal, transgressive, beyond the norm. So, when O9A writes something in Noctulian, the pattern of odd versus even letters becomes a hidden message, even if the reader can't translate it. They use it like a coded frequency. And what's wild is that this system appears consistently across texts from the 1980s all the way to newer scans floating around academia. But here's where it gets sketchy. Because when you compare these numerical patterns to the older political documents tied to O9A's neo-Nazi side, such as those connected to Mayat's Vindex writings in the late 90s, you start noticing parallel structures. Certain phrases consistently encode as Acausal dominant. And guess what kinds of phrases those are? The ones tied to Accelerationism, upheaval, the destruction of the old order, and the Vindex mythos. So language, even decorative language, becomes a recruitment funnel, a psychological test. If you feel drawn to the Acausal heavy words, they push you deeper. If you don't, they lose interest. It's not an alphabet. It's a behavioral sorting mechanism disguised as a linguistic experiment. And that brings us to the symbol almost nobody talks about, the 144 grid from O9A's Star game. If you've never seen it, picture a cube subdivided into smaller cubes, each one containing a number. It looks like someone tried to merge a Rubik's cube with a numerology chart. Now here's the kicker. Anton Long wrote, in texts documented in the 2019 analysis by the International Center for the Study of Radicalization, that this number grid represents the unseen architecture of the Nexian. A Nexian is their term for a human who becomes a gateway to Acausal energies. In normal language, someone we can radicalize into doing things for us. That's basically what they mean. And the numbers are part of that radicalization process. The Star game uses number manipulations that supposedly correspond to the initiate's psychological evolution. Except when researchers actually mapped it, like in the analyses done by Senholt, something odd happened. The numbers weren't random. They matched the sequence patterns used in early British esoteric fascist groups, including the ones Mayat was associated with in the 1970s and 1980s. Meaning, this wasn't a magical system. It was a political cipher wearing occult clothing. And if you think that sounds too convenient, look at this. In the late 80s, manuscript Naos, which is one of O9A's foundational texts, there's a section that correlates Star game moves with real-world actions. And these actions line up frighteningly well with the insight roles we talked about in your previous episode. For example, a particular move, shifting from the 13th node to the 21st, is described as the transition from personal ignorance to necessary transgression. Then you check the political writings Mayat published around the same time. Same phrase, same structure, same concept. The only difference is the vocabulary. So what does that tell you? It tells you the symbolism wasn't invented because O9A believed in some cosmic cube. It was invented to mask an extremist pipeline as spiritual development. Which is why, by the way, counterterrorism investigations, like the 2020 to 2021 UK reviews, mention O9A's esoteric numerology in the same breath as their recruitment practices. Now, let's go deeper. Let's talk about their Sigil system, because that's where all the messy, creepy, are you serious? stuff starts to overlap with actual danger. If you've ever seen an O9A sigil, you know they love lines, angles, overlapping geometric shapes that look like someone tried to abstract a compass. But here's what most people miss. Each O9, a sigil follows a formula: 3 internal angles, 9 external pressure points, and a ratio they call the 1:7 resonance. Where have you seen those numbers before? 3 equals the triad, 9 equals the 9 angles, 7 equals the spheres of the tree of Wyrd. It's branding, symbolic consistency. They embed their philosophy into everything, so the initiate slowly starts associating the numbers with meaning. Every time they draw the symbol, they reinforce the ideology. It's a feedback loop. But then there's the darker layer, the part I'm warning you about. Some O9A sigils hide coded locations. And I know that sounds like a stretch, so let me explain how we know. In the early 2000s, in an academic review by Goodrick Clarke, he mentions that certain O9A diagrams line up with geometric overlays of real-world points used in the British countryside by fringe occult circles. Then in the 2019 to 2021 investigations involving O9A linked individuals, police actually found hand-drawn sigils referencing bridges, woodland entries, abandoned buildings. The symbols weren't abstract. They were maps, not all of them, but enough to show a pattern. And remember the culling concept from your previous episode? Some of these sigils were tied to locations where insight roles were supposed to be performed. And when you compare the designs with known O9A operational manuals, yeah, they match. So when people say, O9, a symbolism is harmless, they're either misinformed or, let's be real, deliberately downplaying it. Now there's one last piece, and honestly, this one annoys me the most. The obsession with mirrors. You've probably seen those cryptic O9A passages where they talk about reflection, mirrored connections, reversal, or inversion. People think it's metaphorical. It isn't. O9A uses mirror imaging as a form of ideational camouflage. A sentence might read one way, but reverse the word order, or sometimes the letters, and it reveals the underlying meaning. This is documented, by the way. Researchers like Seek and Risexam Monet point out multiple places where O9A texts include reversible structures, hidden messages, and symmetry. It's childish, but effective. For example, in several O9A poems from the 1990s, poems that look like angsty early internet goth writing, if you reverse the line order, you get references to Vindex, downfall of the Magin, and other ideological points. So when O9A uses mirror symbols, cracked circles, split sigils, inverted runes, they're not doing it because it looks cool. They're signaling there's a hidden layer beneath what you're reading, which becomes extra disturbing when you realize this is the same technique used in some white supremacist encryption systems online, where phrases read normally mean nothing, but flipped versions reveal the message. O9A turned occult symbolism into a mask for extremist propaganda. That's the truth of it. And if you've been listening to this whole episode, sitting in the dark, maybe sipping your terrible energy drink, tell me, did you ever imagine symbols could turn into a full-blown radicalization blueprint? Because same. But this is why digging into symbolism matters. It's not aesthetic, it's infrastructure. So here's the thing, and I want you to think about this as we wrap. When you strip away the mysticism, the Acausal jargon, the edgy aesthetics, the runes, The sigils, the made-up language. What's left? A political network using symbols to recruit, radicalize, and redirect human behavior, occult wrapping, extremist core. That's the O9A blueprint. Always has been. Now I want you to jump in the comments and tell me, which of these symbols freaked you out the most? Was it the broken Ouroboros, the hidden maps, the fake language, or the fact that their entire numerology grid is basically a fascist code book in disguise? And if you're new here, welcome to Rabbit Hole. This is what we do. And if you're not new, you know the deal. This isn't the end. This is just where the tunnel gets darker.